Welcome, everybody. Let's get started. Today we're going to talk what I assume will be part one of testing statistics with our expert panelists. Today we have Chad Sanderson and Matt Gershoff, who you all should know pretty well. This is not their first, and I expect it won't be their last time to be panelists in the TLC. But in case you are new to the TLC, Chad is the experimentation and personalization manager, although I think the title may be different at Sephora. Chad, feel free to correct me if I don't have your new title correct.
That's close enough.
It's close enough. It works, right? And he is a digital experimentation and quasi-experimental design professional. Matt is the co-founder and CEO of Conductrix, the decision engine platform that blends machine learning with A/B testing. And he has 2 master's degrees in artificial intelligence and resource economics. And that last comment there used to be under just one of these 2 guys, and it's just relevant for both. So I put it under both of them. They're both TLC regulars because they're just too nice to say no and genuinely like talking about this stuff. So thanks, guys. Welcome back. Really appreciate you putting yourselves in the hot seat and doing all you can to help the industry turn up the dial a little bit and learn a little bit more about the statistics that are the foundation of everything we do. Tim kicks us off with a great question, which I think will set the mood for the rest of the day, which is it possible to be Matt Gershoffed by Chad Sanderson? Is that a transferable phenomenon?
Let's do that.
Let's do it. I think it's great.
Or maybe.
I think we should be Sanderson.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Or maybe we just get a new one.
Don't put that pressure on me.
Hey, you don't want that pressure. You don't want to be Sanderson.
I think we all do, and we all have. So let's get going. I'm going to dive right in. I'm going to start with the prioritized questions that we sent over in the survey, and some of these questions may be more relevant for one of you than the other, so I'll definitely direct that to the appropriate person, but otherwise, if you want to speak up at any time, feel free to jump in. And those of you that are TLC members that want to ask additional questions, put those in the TLC Slack or in the TLC Zoom, or just take yourself off mute and interject yourself. So let's go. The first question, as prioritized by the TLC group, is what is the relationship between power and confidence, and how do you choose the settings for each? And Matt, I'll let you start. You're on mute.
Sorry.
There you
go. Yeah, so I mean,
doing great so far.
Yeah, I'm killing it. So, you know, this is sort of the kind of the kernel of why you're running a hypothesis test in the first place, I think. And so, I don't know if anyone got a chance to I sent it out a little bit late, but I sent out some sheets with some information. And at least from my point of view, and Chad, or actually anyone else, who's listening, is free to interject and have a different perspective. But for me, at least, and this is kind of from a frequentist point of view, the point of running the A/B test in the first place is to mitigate potential errors, certain types of risk. And there's 2 types of errors. I think I assume everyone is sort of familiar with the 2 types of errors that one might face, right? And so there's 2 states of the world, potential states of the world, right? And let's say we have our control and we have our treatment. We could either believe that the treatment is better than the control, right? And the world agrees with us, which is great, or the world disagrees with us, and actually the treatment isn't better than the control, right? And so really the treatment and the control are really being generated maybe by the same process. It's as if you're doing an AA test. And that's a type 1 error. And you may not want that to happen, right? Like you may not want to make a decision based upon that belief, that mistaken belief, and take some action because you might be a misallocation of resources. There might be some sort of cost to doing that. And conversely, if you're thinking of it sort of as in like a little confusion matrix, it could be that we believe that the control, right, the A, is is either better than B or is the same. And so B is not better. The treatment is not better than the control, but the world says otherwise. And actually the treatment is better than the control. And that's our type 2 error, right? And we don't want that to happen either, because that's just, we're bunkered in and we're doing the same thing that we had always been doing. And if we had taken the new action, right, we've taken action based upon the belief that the treatment is better, we might be in a higher value state, right? We might get some sort of return. So by not doing it, we're foregoing those returns, and that's opportunity cost. And we don't want that to happen either. So the point, at least from my perspective, of even bothering to run hypothesis tests, by test, I mean the actual calculate the t-score, do the p-value, have that threshold, that whole procedure is to mitigate these two risks. So assuming you have some understanding of the value of those risks, and you really should, it's important. I know this can get a little confusing, but it's worth the effort to understand that a little bit. And so it's fine to spend a weekend just kind of mulling it over, or shorter. For me, years.
As we all do.
Yeah, or me, it's years, just to really grok that. It's very important, I think. And then the whole point of, now getting back to the question, is, well, how do we set significance and power? And so significance level is the risk, right? Is the control, is the risk of making.
Just to interject for just a second, for those who may not know, significance is the inverse of confidence. So when he's speaking of significance, he's talking about the alpha, which is 1 minus.
The confidence level. Okay.
The confidence. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So the confidence level is, let's say, is at a 95%, right? Which means is you're willing to make that error. I accidentally take an action away from the control. I execute on the treatment when really I probably shouldn't have.
Because there's really no difference.
Right. The type 1 error.
Mm-hmm.
You can control that. And so based upon your experiment, how much data you collect, you can mitigate that and say, I'll only do that 5% of the time, right? Which would be at a 95% confidence level. Your alpha is 5%, or a 1%, right? It's like, if it is the fact that the world state is that these two things are the same, right? Given that that's the case, I can still control that error and make sure I don't take it 5%, 1%, 1/10 of a percent, 20%, whatever. So that's your alpha, that's your confidence. And then the power is about type 2, and is that opportunity cost, right? Because if you could easily say, you could reduce that to 0. You could reduce your type 1 error to 0 and just never change, right? So you could make that 0 if you wanted to, but there's a cost to doing that, which is your opportunity cost of not taking new actions. And that's where the power comes in. And that's the resolution, or the ability to mitigate that type 2 error, right? And so that's the relationship. You have these two competing errors, and they're all linked together. There's 3 things that are tightly coupled. There's mitigating type 1 error, there's mitigating type 2 error, and there's sample size. And so the sample size you can think of as your payment, is your budget for reducing those 2 errors. And so the whole
greater
point,
the sample, the lower your risk of the errors.
That's right. And if you want to increase, if you want to reduce the risk of type 1 error, you either have to increase your budget, which means more sample size, or you'd have to reduce mitigating type 2 error, and vice versa. So just think of them, they're all sort of in equilibrium. And any 2 of them determines the third. They're all in that relationship. And that's why those power calculators work, is because you can put in the significance level that you want, or the confidence level that you want, the power that you want to test, right? And you give it a few more bits of data, which are the minimum detectable effect and the baseline conversion rate. And then you can get your answer back out. And it's just a little bit of algebra. And so I'm not sure if that was really long-winded, but that's the relationship. But Chad can come in and sanderize us all if he's so inclined.
No, I think that was a great explanation. One of the ways that I like to explain it to people that are more senior than I am and don't necessarily have statistical chops and can get lost in some of these explanations sometimes, is that if we were to take a pretty standard example, so let's say 80% power, that's what most calculators tell you to power your test to. What that's really telling you is that if the lift you care about actually exists, if it's real, then roughly 8 out of 10 times you'll find it if your sample size is of the amount that calculator tells you to be, okay? If your power is 50%, then you'll find it about 50% of the time. So power is the way that you can think about it is just, this is the percent of the time that we would find a real result if it exists, right? That helps a lot of people understand that power trade-off. And then the other thing I wanted to add that I think is also very important to understand is that from a frequentist perspective, the math never tells you what decision to make. That's something that you have to decide on your own, given the information that you've observed. And in some cases, like let's say you're a Microsoft and you can, or a Google, and you can get 1 billion people into a test very, very quickly, and even a small change has a massive effect. Well, maybe you want to have a much, much lower threshold of what gets through, because there is that risk that Matt talked about of something potentially going wrong, a type 2 error, it's not what we thought it was, right? And so maybe you care about type 1 errors more than you care about missing something that does exist, right? Because the chances of it going wrong are larger. But let's say you're a smaller business and you really need those wins. Maybe you'd be willing to sacrifice a 95% significance level for a 90% significance level, or an 85% significance level, or an 80% significance level, right? So there's a lot of trade-offs there, but at the end of the day, it's sort of your decision what level of risk you're willing to take.
Yeah, but I think that's good, but I do think one of the problems in the industry is the focusing on the sample size as if it's like a checkbox, like we got to get through this hurdle, and that I would argue is I don't think that's the optimal way to look at it. Really what it is what is the budget? And it's this trade-off. You're buying something, right? You're not buying the right answer. You're buying mitigating your risk. And so you should, I would argue that you want to take that setup, that time of using the calculator is not a mindless exercise just to get a number out. It's really where you are specifying the problem. You're specifying what is important, and that's going to be determined by your organization, your cost structure, and your payoff structure. Like, why am I doing this? What is a size, what is an effect size that is of value to this organization? And how much are we going to pay to in terms of sample size to mitigate making a bad decision, risk around this decision, right? And so it's an opportunity for you to specify what's the marginal cost of things, and what's sort of the payoff I expect to get from this decision. And sometimes that can be useful for you to not even bother running the test, because it's like, who cares? It's like, if the detectable effect size is X and that's going to take us a year, it's probably not worthwhile for us to bother with this. And maybe the minimum detectable effect isn't really that valuable, especially if mitigating risk around it is quite low. So I would put that calculator experience sort of at the front, and it's not like the last checkoff thing. It's really going to help you prioritize and think through the economic value of this decision problem, and the economic value of acquiring information to help you improve. Or it's almost like an insurance policy, right? And you're trying to kind of mitigate insurance, and you're going to pay a little bit of something, and the payment is the sample size. But it should not be this mindless exercise and you're just plugging in numbers. You're just wasting your time, I think, personally.
I like that example.
Are you just missing opportunity to like learn more about your organization and the problem?
I love it. I actually, over in the Slack channel, I just posted Tim's calculator that he created for us at Search Discovery that has the ability for you to use the process of calculating your sample size as a learning opportunity both for you and for your stakeholders, so that you can adjust things like confidence and power, as well as a couple of other things, and do it in different ways. And as you adjust them, and you see how that impacts the increase in risk. So the samples are the payment that you make. I really like that language, which I think other people will be able to use back with their stakeholders. But I want to take this one level deeper. And Chad, the example you gave of when you might make different decisions about power or confidence, you chose to compare, say, a large company with a smaller company or whatever. But what if I'm a single company and I'm running two very different types of tests? Say one of the tests that I'm running is to make a decision about rolling out a new and maybe expensive recommendations engine where I have to pay a third-party vendor to provide the information, versus a test where I'm trying to make a decision about what banner makes the most sense to target to which individuals. Is it possible that you might want to use different power and confidence decisions even within the same company?
Absolutely. They should be different for every test that you run. So just to kind of, because that moves very nicely from the point that Matt just made, which is that your sample size and your minimal detectable effect and all of these things should be outcomes of a process you have around determining what's most important to generate that minimal detectable effect in the first place. So it might be, in the example that you gave, if you're just, let's say, switching banners on a site, that the cost to switch those banners is minimal, right? So let's say you already have a person, it's their full-time job to switch those banners, they're going to be doing it anyway. The incremental cost of switching them is going to be low. And you know from past experience that it doesn't really matter what banner you show. The most you can expect to see is a couple percentage points in lift. You're not going to drastically affect the site either way. That's going to make an impact on what your minimal detectable effect is going to be for any particular experiment. But let's say you're doing something new. So we're adding a brand new feature to the site. This is a totally different exercise. Now you have costs involved, right? Now you have teams, potentially entire groups of product managers, of maybe salespeople, of marketing people that are going to have to get invested, maybe even executives that are going to need to sit around and figure out what this decision is going to be. You've got to pay those people's salaries by the hour. Sometimes you have to pay them huge amounts if you bring in like contractors and consultants. You might be testing on a completely different part of the page. You might be testing for different metrics, which is something we haven't got to yet. But a brand new feature may have a laundry list of metrics that you want to make sure is either being affected or not being affected. You might require a way higher sample size to ensure that you're not knocking something off that's pretty important to you. Most people don't like talking about things like bounce rate, like it's an irrelevant metric. But if you have a test that's improving your conversion, but it's increasing bounce by 20 or 30%, well, maybe that's okay in the short run because you're making money. But maybe in the long run, that's going to have a real effect. And that's not something you might have to worry about if you're just changing banners. So all of those things come into play when you're thinking about what is the effect size that I care about, what is the power that I care about, what is the significance that I want to detect.
So you guys heard it here. Chad Sanderson says the so-called best practice of using 95% on every test is stupid. That's what he said. I just reframed it. He's like, no, I didn't. No, I didn't.
And someone, sir, yeah.
All right, let's move to the next question. How do you estimate runtime and calculate stat sig or whatever else to know that you really have a difference for non-conversion rate metrics? We're talking here about continuous variables like revenue, AOV, RPV. Who wants to start?
I could take this one since
Go for it.
Matt got the first one. So something that I think is important to think about whenever you're calculating sample size for any metric. Traditionally, in most calculators, the way what's important is the number of visitors that you have, your current conversion rate, if you're using a conversion-based calculator, and the lift that you care about, so your MDE. There's actually another really important piece. It's kind of actually wrapped up in all of those, but that's the variation of your metric. So if you have a metric that has wide variability, like the lowest possible value could be 0 and the highest possible value could be 2,000, that's something that's really important to calculating sample size. And it makes sense if you think about it logically. Imagine if you were trying to estimate the true height of a group of students in a high school based on one classroom, for one example. And imagine in school A, every single person in the classroom is within 2 inches of each other. So one person's 5'6", 5'7", 5'8", 5'6", 5'8", 5'6", 5'7", 5'8", right? And then in school B, you have huge variation. So you have some people that are 5 feet tall. You have some people that are 7 feet tall. You have some people 4'8". You have some people, 6'9". It's going to be much easier to estimate within some confidence interval the true height of school A compared to school B, just because the range is so large. The same thing happens when you're trying to calculate the sample size of any metric at all. It turns out that there is a way to calculate the variance of a conversion. It's called a Bernoulli trial. There's a mathematical formula for doing it. And it has the smallest or some of the smallest variation, right? So when you're calculating anything else, we call those continuous metrics. So it's a metric that could basically be any number, like revenue, for example. You could have huge potential variability, especially if your website sells lots of different products. Revenue per visitor is one that's specifically large, because you could have someone on your site, a visitor, who has an order value of $0, they buy nothing. And you could have another person that buys a lot of things. Like, let's say you sell books, for example. You could have a person who visits and doesn't buy anything at all. And then you could have a library that visits and they buy 50,000 books, right? So the variability is massive. So, but fundamentally, the way that you calculate those two things are the same. There's a formula where you can just plug all those numbers in, and it will give you the approximate sample size pretty easily. The one that I use kind of on an offhand is 16 sigma squared divided by delta squared, right? And I can pass that to the chat, but that's sort of a standardized calculation that where your sigma is your variance or your standard deviation, and your delta is the change between the original metric that you care about and the new metric that you use, which is just your detectable effect, basically. So it's like a point estimate of your detectable effect. If my conversion that I care about,
effect is often called lift.
Yes, correct. So all you have to do is really use the math. Unfortunately, there's not a great online calculator out there for continuous metrics. So if you really want to get it right, I would say start with the sort of fundamental math behind it. Start to learn kind of what goes into it, and then you can always make you can make changes. But I'll post that in the chat on exactly what calculation to use. You can do it in Excel, pretty easy, for example.
If you know the standard deviation.
Yeah, that's so. Just to jump in, so the calculations are actually this, like what you're using in the calculator for the proportion or the conversion rate. You can use the exact same calculation, which is probably what Chad has in his Excel sheet. It's just that for proportion or confidence, for a conversion rate, excuse me, the standard deviation is determined by the mean. It's just the nature of that distribution of the binomial. And so for other distributions, you need to explicitly state the standard deviation. And so
we know it if we're doing a results analysis, but when we're doing a runtime estimation,
well, it's exactly the same as you'd have an estimate, just like today when you're using it's exactly analogous. So when you're doing conversion rate, you type in like what's the current base level and then what's the mean detectable effect, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you do the same thing, but except you'd plug in the mean value, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you have a continuous variable, so what's its mean, which is the same. The conversion rate is just the mean for the proportion. Yeah. So what's the mean? And then you need the standard deviation, because it's not in those types of distributions. it's not defined or not determined by the mean like it is in the binomial. And so you have to plug that in. And so the issue is either you have a guess, which you don't. But if you have past data, you could go calculate it, right? You
Yeah.
use that as a guess.
Same
and if
place
not,
that you went to get the AOV, right?
yeah. And if not, there's like a little rule of thumb, which is hacky. And it's like the range rule of, maybe I can't say rule of thumb. It's a range trick. And so you can just take the max minus the min and divide by 4. And that would give you a very rough, assuming you know the min and the max value, then you can calculate a very rough estimate of the standard deviation. So it's the same, really. We actually have a calculator at Conductrix. Our calculator has a sheet for that. So, it's basically probably what Chad has in his Excel sheet, but it's the same. Just think it's exactly the same. You just need an additional bit of information, which is the standard deviation.
And you can actually, so if you have like a Google Analytics or an Adobe Analytics or anything like that, and you can pull visit level data, you can have that's as accurate as you can possibly be. So you can just have each visit or visitor and put that into an Excel spreadsheet and then calculate the standard deviation, and that's your metric.
Awesome. All right, question number 3. And Matt, I know it's your turn, but I know how much you hate this question, so I'm going to let you take a pass. I'm going to let Chad start, and if you feel the need to just get fiery and interject, I think we'd all welcome it. So Chad, can you explain when and why you would choose one versus two-tailed t-tests?
So I'll say that I've heard some justifications of using two-tailed over one-tailed, and the only one that I've talked to people at Microsoft, I talked to some of the people at Google, and some of the justifications for using a two-tailed over one-tailed is completely around practicality. So it's knowing who's going to be using your testing tools, and it's the idea of making the actual significance level lower than it appears, basically. So I know that sounds kind of wonky, but when we set the alpha rate that we care about, let's say that we set it at 95% significance, which is common, or 5 alpha.
Alpha is confidence or significance. Got to make sure everybody's talking on the same page. Yep.
Yes. So we set an alpha of, like, let's say 0.05.
Right.
If you're running a two-tailed test and you detect a significant result that's 95% significant, your true confidence level, or the true p-value, is actually 0.025. And the reason that's the best rule of thumb to think about, without going into much of the math behind it, is whatever the significance level is that you observe in a two-tailed test, you cut it in half, and that's what you would get in a one-tailed test. In a one-tailed test, all it's doing is it's checking one direction of your distribution at a time. So it's either checking what is the p-value in the positive direction for whatever our significance level is, and then what is it in the negative direction. And it can only check in one direction at a time, right? So let's say, for example, that I have something I've tested, and I think that there's going to be a 3% improvement. So it's going to be better. It's not going to be worse. What sort of a lot of A/B testing tools will do, and part of this is due to convenience, is they'll say, well, we'll do a two-tailed test. That way, if the result is positive, then you'll see that, although the p-value will be a little bit inflated compared to what it would have been if we'd done a one-tailed test. And if it's negative, you would also see that, right? So the problem is if I'm only checking in one direction, you can think of it as like these p-values add up to each other to make one. So if there's a positive lift of, let's say, 3%, and that has a p-value of 0.05, checking in a positive direction. When I'm checking in a negative direction, then my p-value would be 0.95, right? So the one-tailed tests add up together to form one. So if I'm only looking in one, the theory is if I'm only looking in one direction at a time, then I could miss out on a significant result if I'm checking in the wrong way. But the easy way around this is to just check in both directions, right? You can do a one-tailed test positively, and you can do another one-tailed test negatively. So the only real reason to conduct a two-tailed test instead of two one-tailed tests is because you want that additional p-value cushion. You want to make it more difficult to detect a result for whatever reason. And this is
to
actually
do that, couldn't you just increase your confidence cutoff?
Yes, exactly. You could absolutely just do that if you wanted to.
Well, actually, it'd be exactly the same. But just to interject, if you ran two one-tailed tests, but used like a Bonferroni correction, you get exactly the same, I think, as if you ran it as a one-tailed test, because you divide your alpha by 2, which is what you would be doing in the two-tailed test.
Right.
To make it clear, to make it like just a different way to look at it, it's just, what are you trying to do, right? Like, again, it comes back. I keep harping on this, but the main value is you. It's like your understanding of the problem and your understanding of what you're trying to do and your understanding of the costs and benefits and your understanding of how damaging or making a mistake is, right? Mitigating risk. So really the burden is really on you. And what is the question you're asking? It's like, are you playing poker and all you care is if you win? Like, you're not the house, you're playing against the house. You only get a payoff if you win. If you tie or do worse, it's the same. You don't care. All you care about is winning.
And hold on, let me translate that to a test example. So if take that exact example of, you only are going to make a decision if you win. You don't care if you're flat or negative to the house, or in this case, the control, then it really doesn't matter. You don't need to look both ways. You only need to look forward. Or if it's risk mitigation, and you're only going to not roll it out if it's worse, and you don't really need to know with statistical significance that it's better. You just need to make sure it's flat or better. Then you only do the one-tailed in the opposite direction.
So it's like just do one tail. I never understand this. I don't understand why this is so tricky personally, but people get worked up about this one. But it's like, you can say Matt said, and then they can come yell at me. But it's like, if you're just all you care about is this thing better? You only care in one direction. Just like in poker, you only care if you have a better hand. Then I don't understand, just do a one-tail test. Especially if there's so much anxiety. It always feels like there's a lot of anxiety about sample size. This is a freebie. You know what I mean? It's like,
lowers your sample size, to be clear.
You don't have to worry about your
test.
Yeah, everyone's so worried about risk, and if I'm a small company and sample size, and this thing that comes up every single time, it's like, this is the free one, right? This is the one where you get to have a smaller sample size, and there's no cost, if that's your question. And then, as Chad was saying, in the two-tail, it's just you care if it's strictly better by some amount or it's strictly worse. And it's hard for me to think of. I think Tim maybe came up with one a while ago.
We came up with one where you had like a brand new page template or tool that you're going to compare to the existing, and you have no idea if it's going to be better or worse. Maybe the design came out of something other than evidence or data, and you want to throw them up against each other and just see which one does better or worse, and why. So maybe in that scenario, it makes sense to run a two-tailed, but even then, like you said,
I think
Chad said, you could run two one-tailed.
I think it's more like outlier detection.
Yeah.
Right. And it's like you for whatever reason you have something and you want to test if this data is an outlier, right? And you care about like, it's almost like statistical quality control, and you want everything. It's like when I used to work at the Coke bottling plant, I used to sit and I have to use quality control. I had a very prestigious upbringing, and one of my jobs was to work in a factory. And if the soda was too high in the cap, if it was coming close to the very top of the lid of the bottle, I had to dump the bottle. And if it was too low, right, and there was a threshold. So really, I was trying to peg it at a certain level. But if the soda was too high or too low, it had to get rejected. And so in that type of case is where you'd want to run a two-tailed test. And it's just hard for me to think of in our online experience or with online marketing when that would be the case. But I would think that's when the two-tailed test would make a lot of sense, is outlier and quality control, perhaps.
All right. We're going to move on to question 4. If anybody has follow-up questions, feel free to put them in the TLC calls channel.
We're going to get through like a tenth of the questions.
And that's okay. And there's new questions that have been added. So it's all good. So let's go through question number 4. So how would you go about running an A/B test for small websites with low monthly traffic and conversions? The danger is on basing decisions that are not statistically significant.
Why is that dangerous? Why is that dangerous? I don't like this second part of this question. I hate this danger bit, right? It's like, they're not statistically significant. I don't even know what this means. Danger is based on decisions that are not, it's like, again, it's not about statistically significant enough. It's about mitigating your risk. That's why it's, I
right.
Keep
so
back.
let's reframe the question. Maybe it's not about stat sig. It's more about the danger is making decisions that are bad because we haven't done enough to mitigate the risk of them being bad. Hey, Chad, we asked this question to you, and I don't remember if it was on the last call or if it was just a side conversation we were having, but you had a method, or actually I think it was something you posted on LinkedIn. You had a method for running the test or measuring the differences between 2 very small samples in a way that mitigated risk.
And he also wasn't a jerk about the question either.
Hey, I didn't say that, but yes.
I have enough self-awareness.
No, well, the way that I see this question a lot also. The way that I always read it is basically just how do we test on small websites, and sort of the other parts are sort of inconsequential to the rest of the to the underlying sort of assumption. And I think what you have to really, the only thing that you can do is, there's a inverse correlation, or an inverse correlation to how strong your effect is and how many people you need to actually significantly defect it, or to have whatever power that you care about or you're comfortable with. Or
pull bigger levers, and you need fewer people to see.
Yeah. I mean, if you're thinking about, there's this reproducibility crisis happening in science right now, quote unquote. And one of the reasons it's happening is because you have a lot of scientists that have been testing on very small sample sizes. But when you see people asking, hey, you should make your sample sizes bigger in science to sort of, have a more robust experiment, they're not increasing them to 5 million people or 10 or 500,000 people. It's going from like 50 to 100 or 50 to 200. And the reason that generally industries like psychology and other places like that are okay with these smaller sample sizes as long as they're representative is that they're causing really, really large effects to happen, or at least that's the idea. It's something like, hey, can we disrupt somebody's sleep pattern by blaring, a fire siren in their room at 3 a.m. It's like, well, yeah, you're probably going to do that. And I mean, that's not a very interesting experiment. So if you're testing something on a small website, then the question that I would ask is, what are the things that we can change that are large enough to cause an impact with what we have? That would be my approach in thinking about it. If the goal is how do we is focusing on experiments. I think the other thing to keep in mind though is that if you do have a small website in the first place, is that the best place to focus? Like, is it the smartest idea to spend your time thinking of experiments and changing your whole site, which has a lot of cost associated with it? And even if you get a winning experiment, it may not justify the cost that you've spent. So that's what I would keep in mind.
That's very fair. All right, we got 15 minutes left. Let's see if we can get another 2 questions in. Is it reasonable? Oh, I love this question. Is it reasonable to recalculate the estimated sample size in the middle of an experiment once it is clear that the initial lift estimate was way off? And how does this impact significance and power?
I don't know. I don't know if you, I actually, I don't know how to use, at least in a frequentist perspective, maybe Chad does, to use sort of any bit of information and from the initial part of the experiment versus, you know, just rerunning the experiment.
Let me reframe this another way, Matt.
You will bias. I mean, you can kind of bias again because if you're trying to do, I'm not sure. I will be honest. I don't know the answer to that.
Let me ask the question in another way. So before we launch the test, we've done our estimations, we've made our decisions, we've decided that we need 100,000 visitors, whatever, in order to get to the minimum detectable effect. So easy to say that we estimated. However, we've been running the test for about a week. We've got about 20,000 visitors, and instead of the minimal detectable effect we were looking for, 5%, we're seeing a 20% difference, up or down. The question is, really, I think what we're getting at here is, do we need to continue running the test for the original estimated runtime that was based on a minimal detectable effect that was really, really off? Or can we go back and say, hey, how long would we have to run using our same standards that we had used if the minimal detectable effect, instead of being 5, is 20?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, because you're conditioning on the information midway, and it gets technical, and I don't know it. Maybe Chad has more information, but you can stop it whenever you want, right? Go ahead, but you will lose. But there's going to be costs about that around that, which is you're going to lose the guarantees that the frequentist approach gives you around those errors. So I think this is a deeper question, which is how does one go about making some sort of change in the experimental design midway, I think is what this is. And I just don't know the answer to that. I'm just being honest. I don't know.
Any thoughts, Chad?
Yeah, I also don't have a statistical answer to that question because I think, like Matt said, from what I know about frequentist statistics, you no matter when you stop it or you decide to stop it or you let it keep going, you want to run it for an extra time, you're sort of violating the underlying principles of frequentist, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't do it.
Right.
Because
there's business reasons to do it occasionally.
Exactly, because at the end of the day, we're not full-time statisticians. We're business people, and we're making business decisions. So from my practical experience, if you're running a test like that and you see some 20% lift, well, this is actually really a risk question. So the question you should ask yourself is, well, let's assume that this 20% lift is caused by the change that we've made. Are we going to get more value out of letting it run for another month or whatever it is and seeing what actually happens, or taking some other action and trying to maximize our revenue? So ending the test and maybe doing something different. Like there's other potential options that you could do. In my personal experience, my sort of heuristic experience, my method is that if we see some abnormal behavior like that, it sort of follows, it's called Turbines Law. The idea is that anything that looks really unusual is typically wrong, especially in A/B testing, especially in sites that have been tested quite a bit. So it might be an instrumentation error. Maybe you're collecting the data incorrectly. Maybe your audience is wrong, right? These are all things that could lead to those big jumps.
Assuming that the way you figured out what your minimal detectable effect estimation, the way that you estimated it was based on more than just, 5%. If you're just throwing, blind darts, your MDE may be just way off.
But it should have been blind though. Well, wait, I just want to interject here. It should not have been blind. It should have been.
No, I totally agree with that.
It should have been guided by what is of value to the business, right? Like what is something that is minimally valuable to us that we would want to control mitigate these risks, mitigate these two types of errors about.
And we've had this discussion before, and it makes you want to stab things with forks when I tell you that unfortunately businesses don't always know how to answer that.
Yeah,
They don't know how much of a lift they need. They should, but they don't always.
Yeah, but like, you know, whatever. I mean, look, you can do whatever you want, obviously, but if the point of but you don't have to run the test. You could just get an estimate and calculate a confidence interval and get some uncertainty measure. The point of running a test, now I'm not even talking about experiment. I'm not talking about collecting data. I'm not talking about analyzing the estimated effect. I'm talking about the test. The test is a specific thing. It's a specific procedure that you are doing for a particular reason, which is to mitigate this risk. That's the only reason why you would be running a test. That's what you're doing. And so if you're saying that mitigating this risk is not really that important, then fine. Don't do it or stop it. I mean, the risks, I guess what you're asking is, what are the risks of stopping midway? Is that you're going to have a bias treatment effect, right? Because you're using this test as a stopping rule. And so you're going to think, oh, I've got 20% here. But if your rule is to stop it once it gets to a certain size, there's a natural variation in the data. So on average, when you stop early, even if you're using some of the sequential correction methods, the earlier you stop the test, the more likely it is that actually the treatment effect is biased. Your risk won't be biased. The type 1, sort of type 2 errors won't be biased, right? Which would be happening normally with the p-hacking, but the estimated treatment effect size is biased. And to the degree that that estimate is valuable to you long-term, then that might be a problem. If it isn't, then it isn't. I actually think this question is asking the other side of it, which is, I'm not seeing an effect because I picked something too small and I'm
just. Did I keep running it?
Yeah, that's what I think. I think that's not what this is. This is like, can I make my minimum detectable effect size bigger so I can find some sort of effect? That's what
smaller. I think. Right.
I think this is
if I say that my minimum lift is smaller than that, I need a longer run time, and I get to let the test keep.
Did we overestimate our MDEs? That's what I think as well. And I think that when you're thinking about it that way, I mean, taking everything Matt said into consideration, you kind of have to understand what that lift number is actually communicating to you at the time that you see it. It's not telling you that this variation is better than the control. Like, let's say you have 50% or you have a p-value of 0.5, right? All your test is communicating to you at that point is that if there was no difference, if there was truly no difference at all between your A and your B, then this fluctuation of 2% is within expectations. So you have to decide what you want to do with that information. And if you want to say, well, I want to extend my testing period by an additional month because I want to now detect a lift of 2%, that 2% lift it's a phantom, right? It's not a real number that you're basing anything off of. It's just the variation you see at the time. And so I would say that's probably a flaw in how you're interpreting that data. And I think that's the issue that needs to be solved.
That's a really great point. And you guys are both right. The question that I most often get from clients or stakeholders is, well, we did sample size calculation based off of a 5% lift, but the lift we're seeing is 3. How much more data would we need to get to stat sig? And what you're both saying is you're asking the completely wrong question. This isn't really the way to think about it. And the 3% lift that you're seeing now is totally random. We don't have, it could go any way, any direction because it's going up and down. You don't have confidence in that number today. So calling it, saying if the lift were 3%, we would need to run this long is almost like saying if the lift of F. I mean, we just don't, it's a random, it could go any direction.
But there is a way. I think there is a way to do it. It's just, I don't know. I'm just trying to be, I know I've been talking, I think I've talked too much this question because, as I said before, I don't know the answer. So I just want everyone to realize that I don't know. I don't want to present myself as giving advice on this one, really, because I don't know. I think, though, it's really a question about early stopping, and there are ways, I just will say, and it's in that little documentation. There are ways for dealing with early stopping, or to continue on the test afterwards if there's certain adjustment procedures. I'm not an expert in those, but I think this is also slightly different, where it's also asking, can you sort of re-estimate components, which is this extra step, which is you're sort of changing the design, and that I have no idea about. There may be some sort of way, I just don't know it.
Fair. All right, we have 5 minutes. You guys think we should tackle one more question, or should we open it up to the group?
Either one. I think we could get one more, maybe, if it's an easy one.
If it's an easy one, I know. Oh, this should be very easy. When and why should you run an MVT versus an AB?
So this is a good question, and I think it's a good question because there's a pretty unfortunate confusion about what the goal of an MVT test should be traditionally. The way that I oftentimes seeing it used is you want to find what is the best specific combination of some levels of a factor. So I have 3 levels of a hero image: black color, red color, white color. I have 3 versions of some copy. I have 3 versions of a footer. Of those 27 variations, what is the best version of that
recipe? What's the combined recipe that's perfect?
Yes, you can do it in that way. Like, I'm sure websites with ungodly traffic have no problem running those types of tests, but it's just for most people it's not super feasible. And then higher order, when you're looking at like higher order factors, then you're going to see a reduced impact of those to start with. So the real power of an MVT, when a lot of people use it, is to identify the impact of main effects and interaction effects. So the idea is if you're thinking, just to use a non-conversion based example, if you're doing an experiment on, let's say, the optimal cooking method of cookies in an oven, then you might have a few factors that you want to change. Like maybe we want to change the temperature of the oven. We want to change the time that we leave the cookies in the oven. And maybe we have some third factor, like the tin foil that we actually place the cookies on. And then within those factors, we have different levels, and the levels are basically what are our actual combinations. So maybe we want to test a temperature of 100 degrees, 200 degrees, 500 degrees, right, up sort of all the way through. What an MVT will tell you, if you perform it correctly, is how much of an impact do each one of those factors make independently, and then also how much of an impact do they make in some sort of combination. So we might find, for example, that, as we might expect, that cooking time and temperature are really, really important to the overall taste of the cookie by themselves. So if you cook it for a long period of time, there's going to be some sort of distribution of how people enjoy that cookie. And probably once you start cooking it for too long, the enjoyment's going to gradually fall off, right, until it gets burnt.
But too short is fine, because we all like cookie dough.
Yeah, because we all like cookie dough. And so maybe what that MVT would tell us with something like these 2 main effects of time and temperature are important by themselves. And we also learned that the cooking sheet is completely unimportant. So it doesn't matter. We don't focus on it. But we also might learn that there's an interaction effect between time and temperature as well. And those 2 things are actually connected. So if we cook at a very high temperature for a long period of time, we're going to get worse taste faster than if we had focused on either one independently. So from a high level, this is the value that MVT brings, and from a experimentation and conversion optimization perspective, it helps with focus. So if you have many elements on your website, then the idea is how do you know which of those elements are actually important to test upon in the first place? And this is a question that MVT or Factorial can help answer.
Perfect. And Matt summarized his answer in the Slack. He said, run an MVT if you have more than one type of treatment, like size and color, and run an AB if you only have one type, color or size, or template, or whatever you're testing. Awesome. Well, you guys did a great job. I'm going to go ahead and invite you back, as well as some of our other stats experts in the future. Time TBD, but we do have more questions, and we also, Merritt added a question at the beginning that I'm going to add to the list for going forward. And if anybody else has questions, you guys send them my way. We'll just keep asking these questions. And if you guys have follow-up questions based on your conversations that we had today, let's, get it out there. More knowledge, the better. And feel free to continue the conversation on the Slack. Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Chad. Thanks, everybody. Have a great weekend.